I'm not hungry, she said softly, even though her stomach had been empty since yesterday morning, and the lie lingered in the quiet apartment like a shadow that refused to leave. The refrigerator door creaked open with a tired sound, its dim bulb flickering just enough to reveal what was left inside: a single bottle of water, half full, and a take-out container she had already stretched across 2 meals. Emily Carter stood there for a moment longer than she should have, her hand still gripping the handle, as if staring long enough might somehow change what she saw. Behind her, small footsteps padded across the worn carpet. "Mom?" her 6-year-old son, Noah, asked, his voice gentle in that careful way children learn when they sense something fragile. "Can I have a snack?" Emily didn't turn right away. She inhaled slowly, steadying her voice before answering. "Of course, sweetheart." She closed the fridge with a quiet click and turned with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How about peanut butter crackers?" Noah nodded, trusting, because he always did. As she reached into the cabinet, counting the remaining packs without letting him see, her mind moved faster than her hands, calculating, adjusting, promising herself she'd figure something out by tomorrow. She always did. That was the rule she lived by. Figure it out. Don't ask for help. Don't let anyone see. Later that afternoon, Emily stood in the lobby of a high-rise building that smelled faintly of polished marble and expensive cologne. Her reflection in the glass doors looked smaller somehow, like it didn't belong in a place this pristine. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag and checked the time. 3 minutes early. Good. Being early meant being invisible in the right way. The front desk clerk barely looked at her as she signed in, her name written neatly in blue ink, Emily Carter. Temporary cleaning staff. Just a short-term gig, just enough to cover a bill or two. She kept her head down as she stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb higher than she'd ever lived. The doors opened onto a hallway lined with soft lighting and silence so complete it felt intentional. She followed the instructions on her phone, stopping in front of a door that probably cost more than her entire apartment for a year. Before she could knock, it opened. The man standing there didn't look surprised to see her, but there was something about the way his eyes paused on her face that made her shift her weight. Daniel Whitmore had built an empire on reading details other people missed, and right now, he was noticing everything. The faint tremor in her fingers. The way she held her shoulders just a little too tight. The exhaustion she tried to hide behind a polite expression. "You're here for the cleaning?" he asked, his voice calm, measured. "Yes, sir," Emily replied quickly, stepping inside. The space was immaculate already, all glass and steel and quiet luxury, but she didn't question it. Work was work. She set her bag down and got to it, moving efficiently, quietly, like she'd learned to do in every job that required her to take up as little space as possible. Daniel watched for a moment longer than necessary before turning back to his desk, but his focus didn't fully return to the documents in front of him. There was something about her that didn't match the surface. He'd seen it before. People who said they were fine usually weren't. Time passed in small, silent increments. The sound of a cloth against the countertop. The faint hum of city life far below. At one point, Emily reached for a glass, her hand slipping just slightly as it tapped against the marble. It didn't shatter, but the sound echoed sharper than expected. She froze. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked up. "It's fine," he said, and then, after a pause, "Are you okay?" The question hung between them, simple and direct. Emily nodded immediately, too quickly. "I'm fine." 2 words. Automatic. Practiced. He held her gaze for a second longer, as if weighing something unseen, then gave a small nod and returned to his work. But the words stayed with him. "I'm fine." He had heard them before. And he had learned, the hard way, that they rarely meant what they said. The elevator doors closed behind Emily with a soft whisper, sealing in the quiet that followed her. All the way down to the lobby, and for a moment she leaned back against the cool metal wall, letting her shoulders drop just slightly now that no one was watching, her reflection staring back at her from the brushed steel, eyes tired, smile gone, just a woman counting the hours until the next problem arrived. Outside, the late afternoon air carried a faint chill, the kind that slipped through thin fabric and settled into your bones, and she pulled her jacket tighter as she walked toward the bus stop, mentally listing what she needed to do next, what she could postpone, what she could pretend was not urgent yet. Rent was due in 5 days. The electric bill sat unopened on the kitchen counter. And the refrigerator, she pushed that thought away before it could fully form. At home, Noah sat cross-legged on the floor with his coloring book, his small hands moving carefully inside the lines as if precision could somehow bring stability to a world he did not yet understand. "Did you get the job, Mom?" he asked without looking up. Emily paused in the doorway, her hands still on the knob. "It is just for a few days," she said gently, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "But yes, I did." Noah smiled, bright and immediate, like hope had no reason not to exist. "That is good," he said. "Because I like when you smile more." The words landed softly, but they stayed. Emily set her bag down and moved toward the kitchen, her steps quiet, measured, as if sound itself might reveal too much. She opened the cabinet, counting again, always counting, always calculating how to stretch something into more than it was meant to be. Peanut butter. Half a loaf of bread. A few crackers left. It would have to be enough. It always had to be enough. Back across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood by the wide glass windows of his office, the skyline stretching endlessly before him, but his attention was not on the view. The documents on his desk remained untouched, numbers and contracts waiting for decisions that usually came easily to him, but today there was a disruption he could not quite ignore. He replayed the moment in his mind, the slight tremor in her hand, the way her voice tightened just enough when she said she was fine, the kind of detail most people dismissed, but he did not build his company by dismissing details. He had learned to follow them. "You are distracted," his assistant Claire said from the doorway, her tone observant but not intrusive. Daniel did not turn immediately. "Am I?" he replied. Claire stepped closer, setting a file on his desk. "You have read the same page 3 times. A faint pause settled between them. Finally, Daniel exhaled quietly. "The cleaning staff from earlier," he said, almost as if speaking the thought aloud might clarify it. "There is something off." Claire raised an eyebrow slightly. "Off how?" Daniel considered the question, searching for something concrete. "Not off," he corrected. "Hidden." He turned then, his gaze sharper now, focused. "Find out who she is." Claire did not ask why. She simply nodded. "Of course." Back in her apartment, Emily knelt beside Noah, helping him fold his small blanket for bedtime, her movements gentle, practiced, each gesture a quiet promise that she would keep things together no matter how fragile they felt beneath the surface. "Mom?" Noah asked, his voice softer now, sleep beginning to pull at his words. "Yes, sweetheart?" He hesitated, then looked up at her with the kind of honesty only a child could offer. "When you say you are fine, does that mean you are really fine?" The question caught her off guard, not because it was complicated, but because it was too simple. Emily brushed a hand through his hair, her smile returning, softer this time, more careful. "It means we are going to be okay," she said quietly. Noah seemed to accept that, his eyes closing as he curled into his blanket, trusting her answer without needing to understand it. Emily stayed there a moment longer after he fell asleep, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, grounding herself in it. Then, slowly, she stood and walked back to the kitchen. The apartment was silent again. She opened the refrigerator door once more, the same dim light, the same emptiness staring back at her, and this time she did not look away as quickly. Somewhere across the city, a man who had everything money could buy was beginning to question the one thing he could not ignore, and without knowing it, Emily Carter had just become the detail he could not stop seeing. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of gray light that slipped through thin curtains and made everything look softer than it really was, and Emily was already awake before the alarm, lying still for a moment as if delaying the day might somehow make it easier to face. The hum of the refrigerator reached her from the kitchen, steady but hollow, and she exhaled slowly before pushing herself up, her feet meeting the cold floor as she moved through the small apartment with practiced silence. Coffee was not an option today. She filled a glass with tap water instead, taking a sip as she glanced toward the counter where the unopened bill still waited, its presence louder than any sound in the room. Behind her, Noah stirred, his small voice drifting out from the bedroom. "Mom? I am here," she answered immediately, setting the glass down and walking toward him with a warmth she made sure never faded in front of him. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Is it a school day?" "It is," she said with a soft smile. "And you are going to do great." As she helped him get ready, tying his shoes and smoothing his hair, her mind stayed ahead of her, already planning the hours she would need to stretch, the energy she would have to borrow from tomorrow just to make it through today. Breakfast was simple. 1 piece of toast each. She made sure his had a little more peanut butter than hers. He did not notice. He never did. Outside, the air carried a sharper chill than yesterday, and Emily walked him to the bus stop, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if the contact grounded them both. When the bus doors closed and pulled away, Noah waved from his seat, smiling as if everything in his world was exactly as it should be. Emily held that image for a second longer before turning back toward the direction of the high-rise building, her steps steady even as the weight of everything she was carrying pressed quietly against her. By the time she arrived, the lobby was already alive with movement, polished shoes crossing marble floors, voices low and controlled, a world that operated on a rhythm entirely different from hers. She signed in again, her name the same, her role unchanged, and stepped into the elevator, watching the numbers climb as if they marked the distance between two realities that would never fully meet. When the doors opened, she moved with the same quiet efficiency as the day before, setting her bag down, gathering her supplies, and beginning the work that allowed her to exist in spaces that were never truly hers. Inside his office, Daniel Whitmore stood near his desk, his gaze briefly lifting as she entered, though this time he did not look away as quickly. There was a subtle shift in him, a decision forming beneath the surface. He had not built his life on assumptions, and he was not about to start now. "You are early," he said, his tone neutral but observant. "Yes, sir," Emily replied, already moving toward the far side of the room. "I prefer to start before things get busy." Daniel nodded once, but his attention lingered longer than necessary. There it was again. The same controlled movements. The same careful distance. The same quiet insistence that everything was fine. Across the room, Emily reached for a cloth, her fingers tightening just slightly as she moved, and for a brief moment she felt his eyes on her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her aware, as if something about her had been noticed that she had worked very hard to keep hidden. She kept her focus on the task, wiping down the surface in slow, deliberate motions, her breathing steady, her expression composed. Time passed in that quiet tension, the unspoken awareness moving between them like something neither had fully acknowledged. Then, without warning, her phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She hesitated before checking it, a small instinct telling her to ignore it, but something in her chest tightened, and she reached for it anyway. The message was short. From the school. "Please call us regarding Noah." For a second, the world narrowed, the room around her fading just enough for the words to feel louder than they should have. She swallowed, her grip tightening around the phone before she slipped it back into her pocket, her posture straightening almost immediately. Not here. Not now. She finished the motion she had started, setting the cloth down with steady hands, and turned slightly as if nothing had changed. Daniel had seen it. Not the message itself, but the shift. The way her breath paused. The way her shoulders stiffened just enough to reveal something underneath the surface. "Everything all right?" he asked again, the same question, but this time quieter, more deliberate. Emily met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough for him to see the answer she would never say out loud. Then she nodded, her voice calm, practiced, unwavering. "I am fine." And this time, the words felt even less true than before. The seconds after she said it seemed to stretch longer than they should have, as if the room itself did not quite believe her, and Daniel did not respond right away, his eyes holding hers just long enough for the silence to become something noticeable before he gave a small nod and returned to the papers on his desk, though the movement felt more like a pause than a conclusion. Emily turned back to her work, her hands steady out of habit rather than ease, but the message in her pocket had already changed the rhythm of her thoughts, each second now measured against the question she had not answered, each movement slightly quicker as if finishing faster could somehow fix what waited outside this room. She moved from one surface to another, keeping her breathing even, her expression neutral, her focus locked on simple tasks that did not ask anything of her except completion. Across the room, Daniel signed a document without reading the final line, something he had never done before, and set the pen down with a precision that masked the distraction pulling at his attention. He had seen that look before, not in boardrooms or negotiations, but in places far removed from glass towers and controlled environments, places where people learn to carry too much without letting it show. He stood slowly, the chair sliding back with a soft sound, and crossed the room with an ease that came from years of knowing exactly how much space he occupied. "Take a break," he said, his tone even, leaving no room for argument but also no pressure. Emily glanced up, surprised, her instinct immediate. "I am fine. I can keep working." The words came quickly, almost automatically, and she reached for another cloth as if to prove it. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply repeated, "Take a break." There was something different in the way he said it this time, not authority, not insistence, but certainty, as if he already knew she needed it more than she would admit. For a moment she hesitated, caught between the need to keep going and the quiet understanding that she could not afford to make a mistake today. Finally, she set the cloth down. "Just a minute," she said softly. She stepped out into a hallway, the door closing behind her with a muted click, and only then did she allow herself to reach for her phone again, her fingers moving faster now, her heart beating just a little harder as she dialed the number from the message. It rang twice before a calm voice answered. "This is the front office. How can I help you?" Emily swallowed, steadying her voice before speaking. "Hi, this is Emily Carter. I received a message about my son Noah." There was a brief pause, the sound of a keyboard in the background. "Yes, Ms. Carter. Noah is fine, but he felt lightheaded during class this morning. The nurse checked him. He had not eaten enough breakfast." The words landed quietly, but they carried weight she could not ignore. Emily closed her eyes for a second, her free hand pressing lightly against the wall beside her. "Is he okay now?" "He is resting. We recommend picking him up early and making sure he gets a proper meal." Proper meal. The phrase echoed in her mind, simple, reasonable, and suddenly overwhelming. "I will be there soon," she said, her voice softer now, before ending the call. She remained still for a moment after, her hands still against the wall, her thoughts moving quickly through options that did not quite exist. Bus schedule. Time. What she could make. What she could not. Then she straightened, her posture returning to the composed version of herself she carried into every room, and stepped back inside. Daniel looked up immediately, not surprised, just waiting. "I need to leave early," she said, her voice controlled but quieter than before. "My son is not feeling well." He studied her for a second, noting the difference, not in her words, but in the space between them. "Go," he said simply. No hesitation. No conditions. Emily blinked, just once, as if she had expected something else. "I will come back and finish," she added quickly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "Take care of your son." The statement was final, but not dismissive. It carried a weight she was not used to receiving. She nodded, gathering her bag with careful movements, her mind already shifting toward what came next, but something about the exchange lingered, something unfamiliar. As she reached the door, her hand paused briefly on the handle, a fraction of a second where she almost turned back, almost said something more, but instead she opened it and stepped out into the hallway again. The door closed behind her, leaving the room quieter than before. Daniel remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the space she had just left, the details aligning in his mind with a clarity he did not ignore. A child who had not eaten enough. A mother who always said she was fine. And somewhere in between, a truth that had not yet been fully seen, but was no longer invisible. The bus ride felt longer than usual, every stop stretching the distance between where Emily was and where she needed to be, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag as she replayed the call in her mind, not the words themselves but what they meant, the quiet truth behind them, that her son had been hungry enough for someone else to notice. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual rhythm, people walking with purpose, cars passing in steady lines, a world that did not pause for moments like hers, and she forced herself to breathe evenly, to stay focused on what mattered next. When she finally reached the school, she moved quickly through the front doors, her steps echoing softly against the polished floors, her eyes scanning until she found the nurse's office. Noah sat on the small bed, his feet not quite touching the floor, his shoulders slightly hunched in a way that made him look smaller than he was. When he saw her, his face lit up immediately, relief replacing whatever discomfort he had been feeling. "Mom," he said, sliding off the bed and walking toward her. Emily knelt down, pulling him gently into her arms, holding him just a second longer than usual as if confirming for herself that he was really okay. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "You scared me a little." "I am okay," he said quickly, echoing the same words she had used so many times, and something in her chest tightened at the familiarity of it. The nurse offered a reassuring smile from behind the desk. "He just needs a proper meal and some rest," she explained kindly. "Nothing serious." Emily nodded, her gratitude quiet but genuine. "Thank you for taking care of him." Outside again, the air felt colder than before, or maybe it was just the weight of everything settling in more clearly now. She held Noah's hand as they walked, his small fingers curling around hers without hesitation. "Mom," he said after a few steps, his voice thoughtful. "I think I forgot to tell you something." Emily glanced down at him, her expression softening. "What is it?" He hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I was still a little hungry after breakfast." The words were simple, honest, and completely without blame, but they landed heavier than anything else had that day. Emily nodded slowly, her grip on his hand tightening just slightly. "Okay," she said gently. "Let us fix that." They stopped at a small grocery store on the corner, the kind with narrow aisles and quiet lighting, and Emily guided him inside, her eyes moving quickly over the shelves, calculating again, always calculating. She picked up a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a gallon of milk, the basics that could stretch the farthest, her mind already adjusting the rest of the week around what she could afford today. At the register, she counted her cash carefully, each dollar placed down with intention, her movements steady even as the total crept close to what she had left. The cashier smiled politely as she handed back a few coins, the small clink echoing softly in the space between them. Noah held the bag on the way home, proud to help, his steps lighter now, his energy returning with the promise of food. Back in the apartment, Emily moved quickly, setting things on the counter, preparing a simple sandwich, pouring a glass of milk, her hands efficient but gentler now, as if this small act mattered more than anything else she had done all day. Noah sat at the table, watching her with quiet trust, and when she placed the plate in front of him, his smile returned fully, uncomplicated and bright. "Thank you, Mom," he said before taking his first bite. Emily sat across from him, her own glass of water in front of her, her eyes resting on him as he ate, making sure he had enough, making sure he did not notice that she did not take a bite herself. The room felt warmer now, filled with the soft sounds of chewing, the occasional clink of glass, the small rhythms of a moment that should have been ordinary but carried more weight than it should have. Across the city, in an office that overlooked everything, Daniel Whitmore stood once again by the window, a file open in his hand, the information inside simple but revealing, and as he read through the details, the pieces aligned with a clarity he could no longer ignore, because sometimes the truth was not hidden in words, but in what people went without. And he had just begun to understand exactly what she had been trying so hard not to show. The night settled in quietly, the kind of stillness that made every small sound feel louder, and Emily sat at the edge of the couch watching Noah as he drifted to sleep, his breathing slow and even now, his small hands still loosely holding onto the corner of his blanket as if it anchored him to something safe and certain. The empty plate on the table had been a small victory, one she held on to longer than she should have, because it meant he was no longer hungry, at least not tonight. She stood after a moment, moving carefully so she would not wake him, and carried the plate to the sink, rinsing it under lukewarm water, her movements automatic, quiet, practiced. The refrigerator hummed again in the background, no longer completely empty, but still far from full, and she opened it briefly, not to take anything out, but to confirm what she already knew, to measure how long what she had bought would last if she stretched it just enough. 3 days, maybe 4. She closed the door gently and leaned her forehead against it for a second, her eyes closing, her thoughts moving through the same familiar cycle: adjust, stretch, survive, repeat. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore sat at his desk, the file still open in front of him, though he had already read it twice. Emily Carter, 27, part-time work history, no consistent employment over the past year, one dependent, age 6, no listed support system. The information was straightforward, factual, and yet it did not capture what he had seen with his own eyes: the quiet control, the refusal to ask, the way she carried everything without letting it spill over. He tapped the edge of the file lightly with his finger, not out of impatience, but out of thought, his mind aligning details in the same way it always did when something mattered. "You were right," Claire said from the doorway, her voice calm as she stepped inside. "There is not much there." Daniel closed the file slowly, his gaze lifting. "There is enough," he replied. Claire studied him for a moment, then asked the question she had been holding back. "What do you want to do?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he stood, moving toward the window again, the city lights stretching out below him like a grid of endless movement, every building filled with lives he would never fully know. "Nothing obvious," he said finally. "If she wanted help, she would have asked?" Claire nodded slightly. "Then why does it matter?" Daniel's reflection stared back at him in the glass, his expression quieter than usual. "Because she did not ask," he said, and the answer seemed to settle into the room with a weight that did not need further explanation. The next morning came earlier than expected, the light sharper this time, cutting through the room with less softness, and Emily was already moving before the clock reached 6, preparing for another day, her steps steady even as fatigue lingered just beneath the surface. Noah sat at the table, eating his toast with more energy than the day before, his smile returning as if yesterday had been nothing more than a passing moment. "Are you going back to work today?" he asked between bites. Emily nodded, pouring him a small glass of milk. "I am," she said. "And you are going to have a better day too." He nodded confidently, as if her words alone were enough to guarantee it. Outside, the air felt clearer, colder, and she walked him to the bus stop again, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, grounding herself in the routine, in the small constants she could control. When the bus pulled away, she turned once more toward the direction of the high rise, her steps measured, her mind already preparing for the hours ahead. Back in the building, the lobby carried the same polished calm, the same quiet distance, and she signed in again, her name unchanged, her presence still temporary, still easy to overlook. But today, something shifted, though she did not yet realize it. Upstairs, Daniel stood near his desk, not working, not reading, simply waiting, the decision already made, though not yet visible. When Emily entered, he looked up, his gaze steady, observant, but different now, as if he was no longer just noticing details, but understanding them. She moved to begin her work as usual, her hands reaching for the cloth, her focus narrowing to the tasks in front of her, but before she could start, his voice stopped her. "Emily," he said, using her name for the first time. She paused, turning slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her expression. "Yes, sir?" He did not speak immediately, just long enough for the moment to feel intentional. for the distance between them to shift in a way either of them could fully ignore. Then he said quietly but clearly, "Do you have everything you need?" The question was simple, but it carried something more, something that reached beyond the surface, and for a second, Emily did not answer, because she understood exactly what he was asking, and that made it harder to respond than anything else had so far. The question did not leave the room, it stayed there, quiet but present, and for a moment Emily felt as if the air itself had shifted, thinner somehow, harder to move through, because it was not just a question about supplies or schedules or tasks. It was something deeper, something she had spent months learning how to avoid. She looked at him, really looked this time, and saw that he was not asking casually, not out of politeness, but with intention, and that made it harder to respond than anything else he had said so far. "Yes," she answered finally, her voice steady but softer than usual. "I have everything I need." The words came out the same way they always did, practiced, controlled, complete, but this time they did not seem to settle as easily. Daniel did not look away. He did not argue. He simply nodded once, as if acknowledging the answer without accepting it, and stepped back slightly, giving her space, though the question lingered between them like something unfinished. Emily turned back to her work, her hands moving again, but the rhythm had changed, her focus no longer as clean as before, because now there was something else in the room, something that made it harder to disappear into routine. She wiped the surface in front of her, slower this time, aware of his presence even when he was not looking directly at her, aware that something had shifted in a way she could not easily undo. Across the room, Daniel returned to his desk, but he did not sit down right away. Instead, he watched the small details again, the way she adjusted her grip on the cloth, the way her shoulders carried more weight than they should have, the way her movements were efficient but not relaxed. He had seen resilience before, but this was something else, something quieter, something that did not ask to be noticed, and that was exactly why it stood out. Time moved forward, but not in the usual way, each minute carrying more awareness than the last, until eventually Emily finished the section she was working on and stepped back slightly, checking her work with a careful eye. "I will move to the kitchen area," she said, her voice returning to its usual calm tone, as if nothing had happened. Daniel gave a small nod. "Of course." She walked past him, her steps measured, her attention already shifting to the next task, but the moment she entered the kitchen, something changed again, though this time it was not in her, but in him. The space was immaculate, as expected, every surface clean, every detail controlled, but as she moved through it, reaching for the sink, adjusting a glass, straightening a towel that did not need straightening, Daniel followed more slowly, his gaze not on the room, but on her. He had not planned to say anything else, not yet, but something about the way she moved through the space, careful not to disturb anything that was not hers, careful not to leave a trace, made the silence feel insufficient. "Emily," he said again, quieter this time. She paused, turning slightly, her expression composed but guarded in a way she did not fully realize. "Yes?" He hesitated for the briefest moment, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood that how he said it mattered more. "You do not have to answer me right now," he began, his tone even, controlled. "But if something is missing, you should not have to carry that alone." The words were simple, but they landed differently than anything else had, because they did not push, they did not demand, they simply existed, offering space instead of pressure. Emily felt her breath catch just slightly, a reaction she could not fully control, and for a second, the version of herself she presented to the world wavered, just enough to be felt. But then it returned, just as quickly, her posture straightening, her expression settling back into place. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "But I am okay." Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, stepping back again, allowing the distance to return, but not the same as before. Not empty. Not unaware. Just waiting. Emily turned back to the sink, her hands moving again, but this time, the water running softly in front of her did not fully drown out the sound of her own thoughts, because somewhere beneath everything she had built to stay strong, to stay in control, a small, unfamiliar question had begun to form, not about whether she needed help, but about what it would mean if someone actually saw that she did. The rest of the morning unfolded with a quiet tension that neither of them addressed directly, yet both of them carried, and Emily moved through the apartment with the same careful precision, though now every small action felt slightly more exposed, as if the space itself held memory of what had been said, or perhaps what had almost been said. The water in the sink ran in a steady stream, her hands moving beneath it, rinsing, wiping, finishing tasks that required no thought, because thinking had become something she needed to control. Behind her, Daniel returned to his desk, but his attention was no longer anchored to his work, not in the way it usually was, and the file he had closed earlier remained exactly where he had left it, untouched, because the facts inside it no longer felt separate from the person standing just a few feet away. He had learned, over years of decisions that shaped outcomes far beyond himself, that timing mattered, that pushing too soon could close doors that might otherwise open on their own, and so he did not speak again, not yet, even though the question remained unresolved between them. Emily finished in the kitchen and moved back toward the main room, her steps quiet, her presence light, but not invisible anymore, not in the way it had been before. She could feel it, that shift, subtle but real, like a line that had been crossed without either of them fully acknowledging it. When she gathered her supplies, placing them back into her bag with practiced order, she hesitated just slightly before zipping it closed, as if something about leaving felt different now, though she could not have explained why. "I will be done for today," she said, her voice calm, professional, returning to the version of herself that kept things simple. Daniel looked up, meeting her gaze again, and this time there was no question, no probing, just a quiet acknowledgement. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a sincerity that did not go unnoticed. Emily gave a small nod, turning toward the door, her hand reaching for the handle, but just before she opened it, she paused, not long, just enough to feel the weight of the moment again, that space where something could have been said differently, or more, or not at all. Then she stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room still once more. The elevator ride down felt quieter than usual, though nothing had changed, the same soft hum, the same mirrored walls, the same descent back into a world where she blended in without effort. But this time, her reflection seemed to hold something else, something she was not used to seeing, not hope, not yet, but awareness, the kind that came when someone else had looked closely enough to notice what she tried to hide. Outside, the air carried a crisp edge, the kind that made her pull her jacket closer as she walked, her mind already shifting back to the practical, what needed to be done, what she could afford, what she could stretch, but underneath it all, there was something new, something she had not planned for, the memory of a question that did not go away as easily as the others. Across the city, Daniel remained standing where she had left him, his gaze lingering on the closed door for a moment longer before he turned back toward his desk, not to work, but to think. He reached for his phone, his movements deliberate, and after a brief pause, he made a call. "Claire," he said when she answered. "I need you to arrange something." There was no hesitation in his tone now, no uncertainty, just clarity. "Discreetly," he added. "No direct connection." On the other end, Claire did not ask for details right away, but there was a shift in her voice, a recognition that this was not a routine request. "Of course," she replied. Daniel ended the call and set the phone down, his gaze moving once more toward the city beyond the glass, the buildings stretching endlessly, each window holding a story he would never fully know, except for one. Somewhere not far from here, a woman was doing everything she could to make sure her child never felt the weight she carried, and she was doing it without asking for anything in return, without letting anyone see the cost. He exhaled slowly, the decision settling into place not as an impulse, but as something inevitable. Because sometimes the most important things were not the ones people asked for, but the ones they refused to. And this time, he was not going to ignore it. The evening arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost unfamiliar, as if something unseen had shifted just enough to change the rhythm of the day, and Emily moved through her apartment with the same careful routine, setting Noah's homework on the table, pouring a small glass of milk, checking the clock without really looking at it. The grocery bag from earlier sat lighter now, its contents already divided into portions she had mentally mapped out for the next few days, every item assigned a purpose, every meal already planned before it happened. Noah sat at the table, his pencil moving across the page in slow, deliberate strokes, his tongue pressed lightly against the corner of his mouth in concentration, and every so often he glanced up at her, just to make sure she was still there, just to confirm that everything was still okay. "Mom," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think tomorrow will be better?" Emily paused, her hand resting on the edge of the counter, and she turned to him with that same soft smile she had learned to carry like a shield. "I think tomorrow is a new chance," she said gently. "And sometimes that is enough." He seemed to accept that, nodding slightly before returning to his work, trusting her words in a way that made them feel heavier than they sounded. Later, after he had fallen asleep, Emily sat alone at the small table, the apartment quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and for a moment she allowed herself to stop moving, to sit without calculating, without adjusting, without planning the next step. The question from earlier returned, not loudly, not demanding, just present. "Do you have everything you need?" She stared at the empty glass in front of her, her fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly, and for the first time in a long while, she did not immediately push the thought away. Somewhere across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood in his office long after the building had quieted, the lights dimmed to a softer glow, his reflection faint in the glass as he watched the streets below. Claire had already called back, confirming that everything had been arranged, the details handled with the precision he expected, but still, he remained where he was, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding. This was not a transaction. It was not a solution that could be handed over and completed. It required distance. It required care. It required respect for the very thing that made it necessary in the first place. The next morning came with a subtle difference Emily could not quite name, the air feeling just slightly lighter as she moved through the routine again, preparing breakfast, helping Noah get ready, walking him to the bus stop with the same steady presence she had always maintained. When the bus pulled away, she turned back toward home, her steps slower this time, because today she was not scheduled to work at the high-rise. Today was meant to be a day to catch up, to rest if she could, to stretch what she had just a little further. As she reached her building, something caught her attention immediately. A small cardboard box sat just outside her door, plain, unmarked except for a simple label with her name printed clearly across it. Emily stopped a few steps away, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear, but in confusion, because nothing unexpected ever arrived without reason. She stepped closer, her hand hovering over the box for a second before she finally knelt down, her fingers brushing against the tape as if confirming it was real. There was no return address. No note. No explanation. Just her name. Slowly she opened it, the cardboard giving way with a soft sound, and inside, neatly arranged, were groceries. Fresh bread. Milk. Fruit. Canned goods. Items she had not been able to afford, items she had not even allowed herself to consider. For a moment she did not move. She simply stared, her breath catching slightly as the reality of it settled in, not the items themselves, but what they meant. Someone had seen. Not heard. Not been told. Seen. Her hand reached out, touching the edge of a carton of eggs as if grounding herself in something tangible, something undeniable. She glanced around the empty hallway, as if expecting an answer to appear, but there was only silence. No footsteps. No explanation. Just the quiet presence of something she had not asked for, something she had not planned for, something she did not know how to respond to. And for the first time in a long while, Emily Carter did not know what to say to herself. She did not bring the box inside right away, not because she did not need what was inside, but because something about it made her pause, as if crossing that threshold would make it real in a way she was not prepared to accept. The hallway remained quiet, the faint hum of distant apartments barely noticeable, and Emily stayed there for a moment longer, kneeling beside the open box, her fingers resting lightly on the edge as she tried to understand what she was looking at, not the items themselves, but the intention behind them. No note. No explanation. Just exactly what she needed. Slowly, she stood and lifted the box, its weight surprising her, not because it was heavy, but because it represented something she had gone without for longer than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. Inside her apartment, she set it down on the kitchen counter, the sound soft but final, and for a moment she simply stood there, looking at it, as if it might disappear if she turned away too quickly. Then, carefully, she began to unpack it, placing each item on the counter one by one: bread, milk, fresh fruit, eggs, canned soup, things she had mentally removed from her life weeks ago. Her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if each item carried more meaning than it should have. When she reached the bottom of the box, her hand paused, finding something smaller tucked beneath the rest. A simple envelope. No name. No message written on the outside. She picked it up, her fingers hesitating for just a second before opening it. Inside, there was a card. Plain. Unbranded. And on it, a single sentence written in clean, steady handwriting. You did not ask. That is why this is yours. Emily stared at the words, her breath catching slightly, because they felt familiar in a way she could not ignore, not the handwriting, but the message itself, the understanding behind it. She set the card down slowly, her eyes moving across the items again, but now they looked different, not just as food, but as something that had been chosen, considered, delivered with intention. Her mind moved through possibilities, trying to find a logical explanation, a mistake, a neighbor, a program, something impersonal that would make it easier to accept, but nothing fit. Because this was not random. This was specific. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood in the same place he had the night before, his office quiet, his phone resting on the desk beside him, the call already made, the arrangement already complete. He had not asked for updates. He had not followed up. He had done what needed to be done and stepped back, because anything more would have changed the nature of it, and that mattered more than the act itself. Claire stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment before speaking. It was delivered this morning, she said simply. Daniel nodded once, his gaze still directed toward the window. Good. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. You are not going to tell her? Claire said, not as a question, but as an observation. Daniel turned slightly, his expression calm but certain. No, he replied. If she knows, it becomes something else. Claire studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, understanding more than he had said. And if she refuses it? Daniel's gaze returned to the city. She will not, he said quietly. Not because she wants help, but because someone else needs it. Back in the apartment, Emily finished placing the last of the items into the refrigerator, and for the first time in a long while, it looked different, not full, not overflowing, but complete in a way it had not been before. She closed the door slowly, her hand lingering on the handle as she let the reality settle in, not just the relief, but the question that came with it. Someone had seen her. Someone had understood without being told. And that meant something she was not sure she was ready to face. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts, and she turned as Noah stepped inside, his backpack slipping off one shoulder, his eyes immediately moving toward the kitchen. He stopped mid-step, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise as he took in the counter, the fruit, the bread, the small changes that meant more than he could fully articulate. Mom? He said slowly. Did something happen? Emily looked at him, then back at the kitchen, then at the card still resting on the counter, and for a moment, she did not answer, because she was not sure how to explain something she did not fully understand herself. Then she smiled, softer this time, more real than before. I think, she said quietly, someone noticed. Noah stepped closer, his eyes moving across the counter again, lingering on the fruit as if it might disappear if he looked away too quickly, and then he looked back at his mother with a mixture of curiosity and quiet excitement that children rarely try to hide. Who noticed? He asked, his voice soft but hopeful. Emily hesitated, not because she wanted to hide the truth, but because she did not fully understand it herself, and for a moment she glanced at the small card still resting on the counter, the simple sentence carrying more meaning now than it had when she first read it. "I am not sure," she answered honestly, her tone gentle. "But whoever it is, they understood something." Noah nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense in a way that did not require explanation, and then his attention returned to the food, the simple, tangible proof that something had changed. That evening felt different in ways that were subtle but undeniable, the apartment carrying a quiet warmth that had not been there before, not because the space itself had changed, but because the absence that once defined it had been filled, even if only temporarily. Emily moved through the kitchen with a steadiness that felt lighter, preparing a simple meal that did not require careful division or silent sacrifice, and as she placed the plate in front of Noah, she noticed something she had not seen in a while, the absence of hesitation, the absence of calculation, just a moment that existed, without needing to be stretched into something else. He smiled at her, that same open expression, but this time it carried a different kind of ease, as if something he had not fully understood before had shifted into place. "This is good," he said after his first bite, and Emily nodded, her own small plate in front of her, this time not empty, this time not symbolic, but real. Later, after Noah had gone to sleep, Emily returned to the kitchen, the light above the counter casting a soft glow across the room, and she picked up the card again, reading the sentence one more time, slower now, as if the meaning might deepen with repetition. "You did not ask. That is why this is yours." She traced the edge of the card with her thumb, her thoughts moving carefully, not in the direction of who, but why, because understanding the reason felt more important than identifying the person. Someone had seen her silence not as distance, but as weight, and had chosen to respond to it without breaking it. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore sat in his office, the lights dimmed, the usual rhythm of late evening work replaced by something quieter, more reflective, and though he had returned to his desk, the documents in front of him remained secondary to the thoughts that occupied his attention. Claire stood nearby, reviewing notes on her tablet, her presence steady, familiar, and after a moment she looked up. "You are thinking about her again?" she said, not as a question, but as a simple observation. Daniel did not deny it. "Yes," he replied calmly. Claire studied him for a second before speaking again. "Most people would have handled this differently," she said. "Directly. Clearly. With conditions." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Most people are used to being asked," he said. "Or being told." There was a brief pause, the kind that carried more meaning than the words themselves. "And she is not," Claire added quietly. Daniel nodded once. "No," he said. "She is not." Back in the apartment, Emily placed the card back on the counter, not hidden, not displayed, just present, like something she was not ready to put away yet, and as she turned off the light and moved toward the small bedroom where Noah slept, she paused for just a second in the doorway, watching him, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing, grounding herself in the moment. The day had not solved everything. It had not removed the uncertainty or the challenges that waited ahead. But it had changed something small and significant, something that did not rely on promises or expectations. It had reminded her that being unseen was not always permanent. And for the first time in a long while, Emily Carter allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she did not have to carry everything alone. Morning arrived with a quiet steadiness that felt different from the days before, not lighter in a way that erased everything, but steadier in a way that made it easier to stand, and Emily moved through her routine with the same care as always, though now there was a subtle shift in the way she carried herself, something less guarded, something just slightly more open to the possibility that not everything had to be managed alone. The refrigerator door opened with the same soft sound, but this time the light revealed more than emptiness, it revealed options, small but real, and she paused for a moment, her hand resting on the edge as she took in the simple presence of what had been given, not as a solution, but as relief. Behind her, Noah's footsteps padded softly across the floor, and when he reached the kitchen, His eyes moved immediately to the counter, then to the refrigerator, then back to her, his expression curious but calm. "What are we having today?" he asked, his voice carrying a kind of ease that had been missing before. Emily turned slightly, offering him a small smile that did not need to be forced this time. "Something better," she said gently. She prepared breakfast without counting quite as carefully, without dividing portions with the same precision, and as she placed the plate in front of him, she noticed how natural the moment felt, how it did not require effort to appear normal, because for now, it was. After he left for school, the apartment settled into quiet again, but it was not the same kind of silence as before. It did not press in as tightly, it did not carry the same weight, and Emily found herself standing by the counter, her eyes drifting once more to the card, the single sentence that had shifted something she had spent so long holding in place. She picked it up again, her fingers tracing the edge, and this time, instead of asking who, she asked something else, not out loud, but clearly enough to feel it. What now? Across the city, Daniel Whitmore stood in his office, the early morning light cutting through the glass, sharp and clear, his reflection faint but steady, and though the city moved as it always did, something in him had shifted into a different kind of awareness, not one that demanded action, but one that recognized impact. Claire stepped inside, a file in her hand, her expression composed as always. "There is something you should see," she said, placing the file on his desk. Daniel glanced at it briefly, then back at her. "What is it?" Claire hesitated for just a moment, then answered simply. "She showed up today." There was a quiet pause, not of surprise, but of confirmation, and Daniel nodded slightly, as if he had expected that outcome without needing to say it. "Of course she did," he replied. Back at the high-rise building, Emily stepped into the lobby once again, her name signed in the same careful handwriting, her presence still quiet, still easy to overlook for most, but not for him. The elevator carried her upward, the familiar hum returning, but this time, her reflection held something new, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but awareness, the kind that came when something inside you had been acknowledged, even if you had not asked for it. When the doors opened, she stepped out and made her way down the hallway, her steps steady, her movements controlled, but not as closed as before. Inside the apartment, Daniel was already there, standing near the window, his posture relaxed but attentive, and when she entered, his gaze lifted immediately, not searching, not questioning, just present. For a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them holding the memory of everything that had not been said, and then Emily moved forward, setting her bag down, her hands resting briefly on the counter, as if grounding herself before she turned to face him fully. "Thank you," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried everything she had chosen not to say before, and for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel did not respond right away, not because he did not understand, but because he did, completely. "For what?" he asked calmly, giving her the choice to define it, to say it in her own way. Emily met his gaze, her expression steady, not defensive, not guarded, just honest. "For noticing," she said. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since they had met, there was no need to pretend that everything was fine, because something more important had already been acknowledged. The words stayed in the air longer than either of them expected, not because it was complicated, but because it was honest, and honesty, when it arrived without defense or hesitation, had a way of shifting everything around it. Daniel held her gaze, not with surprise, not with pride, but with a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained, because he had not done it for acknowledgement, and yet here it was, offered freely, without obligation, without expectation. "You did the hard part," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, the kind of tone that did not try to impress, only to be true. Emily frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Daniel gestured lightly toward the space around them, though his meaning reached beyond the room itself. "You kept going," he said. "Without asking. Without stopping." Most people would have broken that silence long before it got that heavy. Emily looked down for a second, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the counter, absorbing the weight of what he had said, because it was not praise, not exactly, it was recognition, and that felt different, deeper, harder to deflect. I did not have a choice, she replied quietly. Daniel shook his head once, not dismissing her words, but reframing them. There is always a choice, he said. You just chose not to let it define you. The room settled into a softer quiet after that, not empty, not tense, just still, like something important had already been said, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space with more. Emily took a small breath, her posture easing in a way it had not before, not because her situation had changed completely, but because something inside her had shifted, something that allowed her to stand without holding everything so tightly. I will finish the rest of the work, she said after a moment, her voice returning to its steady rhythm, but this time without the same distance. Daniel nodded, stepping back slightly, giving her the space she needed, not as someone observing anymore, but as someone who understood when to step aside. She moved through the apartment again, her hands finding their rhythm, but this time, the silence felt different, not something she had to hide inside, but something she could exist within without carrying it alone. Hours passed in that quiet balance, tasks completed, surfaces cleaned, everything returning to the same polished order it had before, and yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be seen, only felt. When she finally gathered her things, placing them back into her bag, she paused for just a moment, her eyes moving briefly around the room, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging what had happened there, something small, something quiet, but something that mattered. I will see you tomorrow, she said, her voice calm, but this time it carried a note of certainty, not obligation. Daniel looked at her, then gave a small nod. You will, he replied simply. She turned toward the door, her steps steady, and as she opened it, the light from the hallway spilled into the room, bright but not harsh, just enough to mark the transition between where she had been and where she was going. She stepped through without hesitation, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the space quiet once again. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars passing, people walking, life continuing without pause, but for Emily Carter, something had changed in a way that could not be undone, not because her circumstances had disappeared, not because everything was suddenly easy, but because she had been seen, not for what she lacked, but for what she carried. Back inside, Daniel remained by the window, his gaze resting on the skyline, but his thoughts no longer scattered across numbers and outcomes, instead focused on something far simpler, far more human. He did not reach for his phone. He did not call for Claire. There was nothing left to arrange, nothing left to control. Because sometimes, the most important thing was not fixing a problem, but acknowledging the person who had been carrying it all along. And somewhere between a quiet apartment with a once empty refrigerator and a man who had everything except what he had just found, something rare had taken shape, not loud, not dramatic, but lasting in a way that did not need to be proven. Because he did not change her life in a single moment. He simply reminded her that she did not have to face it alone, and sometimes, that was more than enough.